noon today. So it said 12 a.m. instead of 12 p.m. And so I have opened it up, Cengage back up, and so you have until midnight tonight. Okay, so for those of you who are early morning viewers, that you have the rest of the day. So you have until tonight, when it's that last Cengage, the very last one. This will be your last Cengage.
Woo!
Okay, so in domestic policy, there's a lot of ground to cover. I cannot cover it all, right? In your Congress simulation, you guys read about immigration. So immigration policy, which is part of domestic policy, is something that you've spent time with, reading about, and that you know about. It is on the exam, right? But I don't have any time to talk about it, okay? So, but you've read it, you've done it in your labs, it's something you should be prepared for. Environmental policy, you'll see whenever I get to it exactly what I have, which is not a lot, okay? I mean, well, I could. I teach an entire, my capstone is on environmental policy this semester. But you guys are gonna get approximately 2 slides. So obviously, there's a lot of stuff here that we're not gonna be able to cover, all right? I'm gonna kind of hit the highlights, and I want you guys to pay attention to the things that I'm doing. So the very first question, I think, on your questions for today is the different types of taxation. This is something that's typically a multiple choice question. It's in your book as well. And so it's something you should know. So progressive taxes essentially mean this: the more money you make, the higher percentage of your money goes for taxes, okay? So the more money you make, the higher percentage of your money goes for taxes. And we'll look at what that actually breaks down to, because it's not a lot, right? It's still not a lot. And you have to get pretty far to get up in higher tax brackets, but we will look at that. Proportional tax is when people all pay the same proportional amount across the board. And this is also known as a flat tax, okay? So I make $10,000 a year, the flat tax is 25%. I pay $2,500 in taxes, right? You make $100,000 a year, and the flat tax is 25%. You pay $75,000. You have $75,000 in your pocket. Okay, I take home $7,500. You take home $75,000. That's a flat tax, or a proportional tax. Regressive taxes are the opposite of progressive taxes. They often look like flat taxes, but they're not. A good example of this is a sales tax. All right, you guys say, oh, well, everybody pays sales tax. It's all the same across the board, except for one very important thing. The more money you make, the less money you spend as a proportion of your income, okay? So I am a person who, unfortunately or fortunately, has gone through all of these phases, right? And so, you know, if I was making, for example, whenever I was in college, I got paid $15 a week as a babysitter. And I picked up shifts at the swimming pool as a lifeguard and teacher. And I think minimum wage at the time was $3.85. I'm not joking. And so I would do that for about 10 hours a week. You know, after taxes, I would take home about, you know, $20 from that. Okay. And so I would make about $35 a week. How much of that $35 did I spend every week? All of it, right? And some extra money that I found, you know, somewhere, right? You know, I mean, all of it, I spent it all. If you're making $10,000 a year, if you're making $1,000 a month, if you're making $250 a week or $500 a week, you're spending it all, right? And if you're spending it in places like rent, then you're being taxed on that rent. Whereas if you're spending money on mortgages, which is what I'm doing, then I get tax rebates for having a mortgage, right? And that's not exactly fair, okay? So you are paying everything That's what sales taxes, that's what I'm talking about here. With sales taxes, if you're spending everything you take in, then you're paying a higher proportion of your income. And so what ends up happening in the United States, for example, because we have this system that is somewhat progressive, somewhat proportional, somewhat regressive, is that everybody ends up paying about the same tax rate. There are exceptions, right? But everybody ends up paying about 10% across the board. That's what happens, okay? In terms of the amount of their income is actually taxed. There's also something called an earned income tax credit. This is for people who are the working poor who have children. You both have to be working, okay? You have to have a job and you have to have children. And it's, a tremendous amount of money, $2,000 per kid. It's not a lot, okay? It's not a lot. US taxes, the way that we tax in the United States as compared to the OECD, these are the most developed countries in the world. This is actually the G7, right? Or this is the OECD generally. So we'll look at the G7 a little bit. Our tax rates on labor income about 31.7%, and that's counting everything. That's counting everything that's going in for Social Security, everything that's going in for unemployment, everything that's going in for taxes, sales taxes, etc. Okay, that's where the United States is. The OECD average is at 36. Okay, which is much higher in Belgium, Germany, Sweden. They're going to pay much more in taxes as a proportion of their income. Most taxpayers are in the 15% tax bracket or below. And so if you look at this, about 36 million, I think this is per taxpayer, is going to pay 0 in income tax. There is about 27 million who are going to pay 10% in taxes. And this is actually usually households or tax units. And then 42 million are going to pay, I think this is actually in thousands, but we'll just go with million. 42 million, they're going to pay 15%, 24 million, 25%. And you'll notice if you add all that up that are paying at the highest rates of tax, it's going to be about another, 9 million, 33 million in total are going to pay more than 25%. It's actually pretty low. Okay. And so the question is, what does the government do with all that money? Well, 25% of it's going to go to Social Security, 28% to health, defense, Homeland Security, about 16%, veterans, 4%, transportation, 4%, food and agriculture, 4%, education, 3%, international affairs, 2%, housing, 1%, energy, 1%, science, 1%, labor, 1%, everything else, right? National parks, anything having to do with the ports or anything like that, the environment, all that stuff, all in that 9%. Okay. So let's think a little bit about where this money goes. And there are two types of social welfare that we, the people, receive. Okay. One is an entitlement and one is means tested. Does anybody know what the difference is between entitlement and means tested? Some of you, I know, read the book and did your quizzes. Perfect. So means tested, they test to see whether you deserve or not, and what they're going to use is an income level. Okay. And with entitlement, there's no test. And so what that means is with means testing, do you fall below a certain income level? Okay. Do you fall below a certain income level? Whereas entitlement, it does not matter if you're a billionaire, you still get Social Security. Okay. It does not matter if you are independently wealthy and you're doing just fine, you can get all the VA benefits you want. Okay. So entitlement program government benefits that certain qualified individuals are entitled to by law, regardless of need. Okay. My father was best man at Chigger's wedding. Chigger became the jeweler in town in Pryor, Oklahoma, and started his own business and never paid into Social Security. Okay, Ivan Case. Never paid into Social Security. And when he retired, he was furious because there was no Social Security check for him. And he was complaining to my dad about this. This is obviously many years later, right? They've been married for 50 years at this point. He's complaining to my dad about this. And my dad says, with Chigger, you never paid in. You have to qualify. So that money, that FDIC, or not the FDIC, what does it say in your check? The portion on your check that comes out that goes into Social Security, which at the moment I can't remember the initials, that goes into it, and that's building up so that you have Social Security income, right? You've paid in. What?
SSA for Social Security Administration.
SSA maybe, right, possibly. So that's gonna go into your Social Security fund and you're entitled, right? You work for a certain amount of time, you pay in, you're entitled. Okay, it's an entitlement. Means tested program, this is only available to individuals below a poverty line, and they're going to be different for different programs, right? There's going to be a poverty line that you fall under for the purposes of getting housing assistance. A poverty line that you fall under for the purposes of getting temporary aid for needy families. A poverty line that you fall under and so your child gets insurance, okay? They're all different. They're all different. They're somewhat arbitrary. Okay, they're arbitrary. Okay, they just are set. Means tested gets about 15% of the total social welfare budget. 45% of the total budget goes to entitlements. Okay, 45% goes to everyone who qualifies. My husband was a Marine. Because he was a Marine, we get an amazing interest rate on our house. Right? Because he was a Marine. Period. That's all he had to do. Okay, they paid him also for that. He likes to point out. So anytime somebody says, thank you for your service, he says, well, they paid me. Because he's like, all right, okay. But the point is he gets also healthcare at the VA center, right? He gets other benefits from being a veteran. He messed up one knee while he was in the Marine Corps, so he's a disabled veteran, 10%, right? And so he gets other benefits because of that. He's entitled to it. He qualified for it. Okay? Under Ronald Reagan, under President Reagan in the 1980s, we had, remember the war on poverty I told you about under LBJ? Okay, so LBJ is going to institute the war on poverty in the 1960s. There are going to be a lot of social welfare programs that are meant to triangulate and to address poverty. And, you know, this is building from the New Deal, but, you know, war on poverty, so declares LBJ. Well, Reagan basically declares war on poverty programs, okay, to get rid of poverty programs and to reduce the amount of spending on poverty. So these are the policies that provide benefits to individuals. That's anything, social welfare is anything that provides benefits to individuals, okay? That's what it is. And so that includes education, poverty programs, social security, healthcare, student loans, VA loans, right? VA benefits, disability benefits, okay? All of those qualify. Medicare, Medicaid, all of those qualify. The largest social welfare policies are Social Security and Medicare. 90% of Americans approve of these two programs. Social Security and Medicare. That's old age health insurance, and you have paid in, so you get Social Security like a safety net. It was meant to be a safety net, not a retirement program. But once you retire, people use it as a retirement program, but it's meant to be a safety net. The idea is you save, but there's also this that you can count on. Okay, that's in case your company just guts your pension plan, because there's nothing you can do about that. And that happens a lot.
My grandmother.
Majority of social welfare recipients are not poor. I want this to be very clear. The majority of people who receive benefits that are social welfare in nature, public education, student loans, VA benefits, Social Security, Medicare, are not poor. 5/6 of all money goes to entitlement programs where people benefit regardless of income and regardless of wealth. Okay? Education policy is mostly an entitlement. There are some parts of education policy that is means tested, but mostly it's an entitlement. It's going to provide standards for course material. It's going to mandate days spent in school. It's going to provide funding. It's going to require adequate yearly progress, and it's going to grade districts on performances. Both state and federal government does this. How many of you are education majors in here? 1, 2, okay, 2, that's low, just so you know. And I'm not surprised. I'm not surprised that it's low. I think that a bill has just been proposed by the Oklahoma State Legislature that you do not have to have a college degree to teach high school anymore. It has not passed yet. We'll see what happens. But if that does pass, remember this is both federal and state standards, what is likely to happen? If Oklahoma passes legislation that you do not have to have a college degree to teach public education, what's likely to happen? Yeah.
It's gonna go lower than it already is. Yeah.
Okay.
Hey, Mary.
Okay. A certificate is not the same as a 4-year college program. You don't learn necessarily how to teach people and how to engage. And then you're going to say, because of that, the quality of education is going to go down. What else is likely to happen? What's going to be really immediate?
College enrollment.
Okay, maybe easier process, so you have more people maybe wanting to go into teaching. What else? You'll change your major, okay? What else?
College enrollment.
Most people can't afford college education, like education, train people with so plus income, lower income.
Okay, lower income people, all right? Anything else? Yeah? Sure, and so you're gonna have a lot of people leaving the state of Oklahoma for other states, that's already happened, okay? What else? Yeah? The amount they get paid can be lowered because you don't have a college degree, so you don't get to earn as much. Anything else?
College rates are gonna go down.
College rates are gonna go down? Actually, I think the biggest thing is this, the federal government's gonna take away federal funding. And currently, the federal government pays for 1/3 of public schools in Oklahoma. So, if there is not that level of qualification, the federal government's just gonna remove funding, and so they're not gonna pay for it. And so absolutely, standard of living is gonna go down. So there's 2 subsets of ed policy. There's higher ed policy and common ed policy. Common ed is K through 12. Higher ed is university level, right? And so there's going to be 2 different ideas. And so at the university level, we have, it's all entitlement K through 12, okay? But at the university level, there's some means tested programs in terms of means tested scholarships, Pell Grants, things like that. But there's also entitlement scholarships, right? So I was a National Merit Scholar at the University of Oklahoma, and so they paid me to come here, right? That worked out pretty well. And so, and my college was paid for. Could my parents have paid for it? Maybe, but it was never tested, right? It wasn't a means tested program. Higher ed policy is also gonna have something that's available to everyone, which is student loans. Okay, the federal government is going to pay the interest on your student loans, and they have been paying the interest on your student loans if you have student loans that are languishing, for the last, gosh, almost 2 years, right? They're gonna pay for it for 2 years, during COVID.
Thank you, Trump.
There are 4 major education
I'll
policy
take that.
eras, and this has to do again with Common Ed. We have the National Defense Education Act of 1958, where we said, hey, we are losing our edge in terms of our ability to compete strategically and defensively because people don't know science and math. And so there was this passed at the national level to encourage more science and math, okay, in 1958. In 1965, the Elementary and Secondary Education Act is going to be a much more comprehensive program that definitely still, there's a lot of focus on science and math, but also things like ethics, humanities, reading, arts, all of these things to make people more well-rounded. As a part of it, there are benchmark tests that are instituted. You take 1 test a year. We took the, what did we take? The achievement test at the end of every year, right? Whenever in the 1970s and 80s, that's what we did. We took achievement tests once a year. They did not have anything to do with our grade. They did not have anything to do with anything other than maybe, you know, identifying students who needed more help in different areas. But in 2001, with No Child Left Behind, when that amendment is made, it's the first time, 1965, 2001, the first time there's a major overhaul, and this changes things pretty dramatically. And so what happens with No Child Left Behind? Is anybody old enough to know? You guys are like, we were not born. I know that, but it did affect you a little bit. With No Child Left Behind, what happens is, remember I told you about states being incubators for policy? And how sometimes they try stuff and maybe another state will try it too, or the federal government will take that policy because it works really well. Well, George W. Bush was governor of Texas in the 1990s.
Yeehaw.
The Texas state legislature had passed this No Child Left Behind in Texas, okay? And what it did, it was pretty effective. It showed to be pretty effective that they said, hey, we're gonna set some tests. And if your school overall does not meet it, then we're gonna give you some more money and we're gonna help you to improve. We're gonna bring in some specialized teachers, maybe buy, you know, pay for an extra couple of teachers. And we're gonna focus, we're gonna do another chance. And then if that doesn't, we're gonna do it one more time, but the third time, third strike, what happens? They're gonna cut their funding. They're gonna cut their funding and students are gonna be able to leave and go to different schools. Okay? So we have this program in Texas, and what you see is you see test scores going up. It's really working really well. And so George W. Bush becomes president of the United States, and there's a bipartisan, Democrats are like, hey, if you want to pass something to reform education, we're on board. Republicans are like, hey, this is a Republican policy, we're on board. And they pass No Child Left Behind nationally. And they start implementing, but they don't give states any money for implementation, number one. They just say, hey, you have to do this if you want federal funding. So the money you're already getting, if you want it, you have to do this, okay? And so states don't really like this. With No Child Left Behind, the states find that they're not having as much success as Texas had. They're saying this doesn't seem to be working the same way. And then it comes out about 2005 that Texas had been cooking their books and the schools have been lying about the test scores because they didn't want what? To get their funding cut.
Yeah.
So they had been shifting students around. They had been transferring them out right before the dates of counting, all sorts of stuff. Okay. And so like, oh, so maybe
Texas
this
way.
is such a great program. But now we've instituted this really, I mean, strenuous tests. People are teaching to the test. It changes education pretty dramatically, right? And so in 2015, And we passed something to try to reform this, reduce the amount of tests, but we're still in that testing mode. Still in that testing mode.
I'm a product of it.
So Social Security is also an entitlement, all right? The New Deal, the elderly, and the growth of Social Security are all gonna be tied together. Basically, in the 1930s, whenever Roosevelt is president, he looks out at America, who is starving, right? It's the Great Depression, 1932. People are not doing well. The bread basket has been blown away by the Dust Bowl. And the poorest people, the most vulnerable people, are the ones who cannot work, who are the elderly, right? At the time, the average age of death, life expectancy was 65. And so they set a retirement date at 65. If you make it there and you work and you pay into Social Security, then you can retire, okay? You can retire and the government will have this safety net so you do not live in abject poverty. That's the whole point, not abject poverty because they work. And frankly, it worked very well. The wealthiest age subset of the population are the elderly at this point. It worked, right? The poorest, however, are now children, okay? So we'll talk about that in a second. It's grown rapidly since 35. It's gonna add Medicare at 65 to help deal with health issues because something else is happening, and this is important to recognize, okay? Prior to this time, for the last 100 years before that, states and counties had hospitals that they paid for. Since about 1890, right? States and counties have been paying for hospitals. In 1965, they're still paying for hospitals, right? But the private market is increasing. And so the addition of Medicare is to help make sure that people can still see doctors, things like that, and in their old age. Employers and employees are both gonna contribute to Social Security. So if I'm paying you in cash, right? I told you guys that I got paid about $35 a week from being a lifeguard, swimming teacher, right? I got paid $15 a week for babysitting, right? Now, the $30 or $38 ended up being about $20 to $25 because it went through the taxes, which meant I paid into Social Security and so did the University of Oklahoma, right? But the $15 I got was all cash, right? I was paying for it, all cash, which is great. I don't have to pay taxes on it. I put it in my pocket. I can go directly to Eureka, a little bar that no longer exists, that on Thursday night had $5 entry, all you can drink until 2, right? That worked out pretty well for me.
Good old days.
Good old days, right? So, so that's where I would go off to,
Should open a bar.
right?
$10.
And at the end of the night, I would still have $10 left because I didn't tip. Terrible person. But I wrote poetry to the bartender. I think it's fine. He seemed okay with it, right? The point is, I've had that $10 that would buy like usually a bean burrito at Taco Bell, only 99 cents for 2.
For
at the
2.
time. It was a different time, right? And I could see that realized, right? I could see that money. But it also meant that my employer, who I was babysitting for, did not do what? Pay into Social Security. And they were paying at that time, really, almost half my wages. Right? And so they were paying into Social Security, I wasn't paying into Social Security, so there's no record of that. Both employers and employees contribute. So this is a way that your employers are actually paying you a little bit more. You just don't see it yet. Trust fund is used to pay benefits and to loan money to the government. A lot of our national debt in the United States is because we borrowed money from the Social Security Trust Fund and we haven't paid it back. Okay, we had some surplus in 2000 after the Clinton and Republican Congress had this deal on reducing the deficit. It was wildly successful. We had 3 years of surplus. And we were going to pay it back into the Social Security Fund to kind of get that going again. But Al Gore was not elected by the Electoral College. That was George W. Bush. And so everybody got a check for $250, surplus gone. The ratio to workers to beneficiaries is narrowing. So the trust fund is still going to be in the red, is soon going to be in the red unless it is paid back. If we don't pay it back, or if we don't reform Social Security, it will be unable to pay entitlement benefits.
For us.
One thing I want you guys to think about is the difference between income and wealth. Income is the amount of money collected between any 2 points in time. I told you about my weekly salary as an undergraduate. And then wealth is the total amount of assets accrued, including stocks, bonds, bank accounts, cars, real estate, etc. Okay, so income is how much money you have coming in. Wealth is how much stuff you got. All right, it's a good way to think about it. Okay, now can you make income off your stuff, off your assets, off your wealth?
Yes.
Yeah, how? You can sell it. That's one way, absolutely.
Some lord.
You can invest it so you get the interest, right? That's another way to get income. And so the more wealth you have, the more it is invested and the more money you make that you're not doing anything to earn. It's just sitting there generating money, right? So when we think about that, what that means is that we have enough money. Being middle class can probably easily be defined as having enough money to save money. Okay? Having enough money to save money. Whenever I was an undergraduate, I told you guys how much I was making. Did I save any money at all? The answer is no, absolutely no money, right? Whenever I first went to work as an attorney, I was paid $2,000 a month. My student loan payments were $780 a month. My car payment was $500 a month. And I think because of taxes and so on, I took home $1,400. Did I save any money whenever I was working as an attorney for my first 2 years as an attorney? No, I did not. I did not save any money because I had to pay student loans. I had to pay my car payment. And what was left over, put gas in my car and bought bean burritos, right? So no money was saved, okay? One of the keys to a successful democratic process is a strong middle class. Why? We've talked about this many times. Why does the middle class matter?
They pay taxes.
If it makes up the majority of society, right? If it makes up the majority of society, but what's distinct about the middle class? It's the group that does things, okay? What are you gonna say? It's the working class, okay? But it's a working class plus, okay? So the thing about a middle class is that they are working for a living. If they are not working, then they're not gonna be middle class, right? And so they recognize that working is valuable, okay? And they also most likely came from a place where I did, where I was a lawyer getting paid absolutely no money, right? And living in poverty. And so I can say, hey, look, the fact that my employer didn't offer health insurance was a really big deal, right? If something had happened, how was I going to pay for that? Right? If my car broke down, how was I going to deal with that? If I was, sick, how was I going to pay for the hospital? Right? And so in the middle class, I can say, oh, these things are important. I did not have those things. Those things should be things that people have. But at the same time, I can say, but I got a little extra. And it's good to have a little extra. And so I'd like to keep it. Right? And so I can also understand where those who are wealthy are coming from, right? This is mine, I earned it. And so I can see both sides in the middle class. And that's what's important about it, is that the middle class can understand both sides and can also have the time to participate and do something about it, usually more educated as well. One of the imperatives that I want to impress upon you is that we really must invest in the future. Education, job training, scientific research, infrastructure. Those are roads, bridges, ports, airports, municipal water and sewer systems, right? Detroit, Jackson, electric grid, broadband. Because when we invest like that, what happens is it spurs economic growth. I've told you guys I'm from Pryor, Oklahoma, cultural center of the universe. Pryor is the home to the largest rural industrial park in the nation and the largest industrial park in the state. It was built during the New Deal. The hydroelectric plant that powers it and also powers Pryor and all of Mason County and provides water to Tulsa was built during the New Deal. That's infrastructure that allows for what? Industry and other groups to come in and build things, right? And so by investing in this way in education, people are able to actually do skilled labor, right? But also in basic infrastructure like broadband and roads, then you're able to make the economy work. When we think about poverty, I want you to recognize that Bill Gates, who's not the richest man in the world, right, but who's pretty wealthy, owns an amount, his wealth is equal to that owned by the poorest 40% of the country. Okay, that's all their stuff put together in a large Craigslist listing, right? That's their meager savings all added up, 40%. And this is the second thing I want you to know. 50.4% of all working Americans fall below the poverty line for at least a year during their lifetimes. Okay? Working Americans. I'm not talking about people who are like, oh yeah, well, my Aunt Ann, she hasn't worked in years, right? I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about people who are working are still falling below the poverty line, at least half of us. Only 10% of people who use means tested program use it for more than 5 years in their lifetime. That's from the time it's created to 1992. And which point, what happens? There's an act created by Congress and President Clinton that limits it so that that's the maximum you can ever get. In 2021, 11.5% of Americans live below poverty line. 25,000 for a family of 4 or 12,000 for a single person. Among the low income and poor, low income and poor make up 43.5% of the population. I'm not talking about the 2%, the 4%, 5% of people that need help. I'm saying, hey, look, a massive plurality of people are either low income or poor in the United States. Only 20% of those below the poverty line actually receive assistance, because those means tested programs don't start at that poverty line, they have their own. Here's our poverty rate from 59 to 2015. So we see a pretty big decline, and it's going to go up and down between 10 and 15%. The blue line, the light blue line underneath it, are those who are less than 50% below the federal poverty line, right? Abject poverty. The supplemental poverty measure is really pretty interesting, and I look forward to seeing what it is, or what happens with it. It's pretty new, but essentially what it does is that it adds benefits. Hey, look, you get these benefits, so we're going to add that so you have your income, right? And it's this, and we're going to add these benefits. And so does that bring you up above the poverty level, right? But it also subtracts expenses, childcare expenses, work-related expenses, taxes, child support paid, medical out-of-pocket expenses as well. And so it balances those things out. It's not just income, whereas the poverty level is just income. We have different attitudes on poverty. Americans generally think that government should help, but they also think that the poor are not trying hard enough. And whites' attitudes are related to how they view non-whites. In other words, racism. The media portrays 3/4 of welfare recipients, for example, as African American, when in fact about 1/5 of recipients are African American. This is the media putting this out there. If we look, Black and Hispanic Americans have much higher poverty rates than other groups. All races, kind of the line there, that's that gray line we were looking at earlier. Asian Americans in green, white, not Hispanic in blue, and then the blue and gold at the top, blue is Hispanic and gold is Black Americans. We have some different opposing views on why we have poverty. There's this idea of a culture of poverty, that there are negative attitudes and values toward work, family, and success that mean people are not going to be able to succeed. But, and part of that is that the poor are present-minded, or lack self-control, exhibit poor work habits, lack positive aspirations, and have weak family structures and relationships, okay? Hostile environments is the opposing view, that there's racial discrimination, social and cultural customs, and educational limits. And one thing that I want you guys to know is that the primary link to disparity in income is unequal access to quality education. It is the primary link to income disparity. People are poor because of external barriers to their success. These are two opposing views. There have been some studies. There's someone who studied families across classes and spent 10 years following them. And what he found was that this was not true in terms of the culture of poverty. They studied these families and said whether you are rich or poor or middle class, people have just different attitudes toward the present, toward aspirational ideas and their family structures. More work does not mean less poverty. The United States has more people in the workforce who work longer hours, and it has more poverty than every other industrialized country. We work harder and longer, and more of us are in the workforce, and yet we have more poverty. Here we are as compared to the G7. This is how much we work in 2015, 68.3 hours a week on average.
It's a slow week.
30% of our total budget is going to go to health. About 7.5 to veterans, 6% to subsidies of the ACA, 0.5 to CDC, FDA, USDA, et cetera, to like test things. 21% are going to go to children, 15% to Medicaid, and 50% of that is going to go to Medicare. Can we take attendance?
It's live.
Pandemics are how, that CDC, going back really quickly, the CDC gets about 0.5% and it shares it amongst them. And they're on the front lines anytime something like this happens. Attendance is live. Meanwhile, we're not being great to our planet. Rachel Carson in 1962 writes Silent Spring, where she talks about toxins and the impact of that. And in 1970, 3/4 of freshwater lakes and rivers were unfishable and undrinkable. Cool. There's still 4 minutes. The EPA is formed as a result of this, but today we have, because this is one of the world's safest water supplies, 92% of water is safe, but if you were in Jackson, Mississippi, you know that what happened? Just this past year, completely undrinkable water. Detroit, we have lead poisoning, killing children as well. Just outside of Detroit, actually. Climate change and air quality are also big issues. Like I said, I just taught an entire class on it. This is a slide here. So my question for you on the poll is, which do you prefer in terms of spending money? Where would you rather spend money? Would you rather spend money on old age insurance